Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. On behalf of our wonderful board of directors, staff, volunteers, and members, I would like to thank Mayor Eric Johnson and his terrific staff for asking us to partner on this program tonight. Mayor Johnson honored the museum by speaking at our ribbon cutting ceremony on September 17, 2019, the day before we opened our new museum to the public. So we were delighted when he reached out to us to ask if we would be a part of this program. Following the discovery in October of the anti-Semitic graffiti at the Reunion Arena Garage, not far from the museum, he reached out to me to assure us that the city of Dallas would not be intimidated by hate speech or hate crimes. We are very grateful for Mayor Johnson's commitment to speaking up against anti-Semitism, racism, and bigotry, and we pledge to do our part to help Dallas and the Metroplex understand the devastating consequences of unchecked prejudice and hatred. The mission of the museum is to teach the history of the Holocaust and advance human rights to combat prejudice, hatred, and indifference. At the museum, we strive every day to educate our community on how acts of violence, genocide, and hatred have negatively and horrifically impacted communities around the world. Though we are a museum dedicated to teaching history, our goal is also to impact attitudes and change behavior today to encourage upstander behavior. An upstander is someone who stands up for other people and their rights, combats injustice, inequality, or unfairness, sees something wrong, and works to make it right. So I am delighted to have the opportunity to speak to our panelists, 5 incredible upstanders tonight, to discuss issues that our community and the nation are grappling with. Before we begin, it is my honor to give a very warm welcome to Mayor Eric Johnson, who will share some remarks. Mayor?
Well, thank you very much, Mary Pat, for that introduction, and good evening to everyone. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists for participating. I especially want to thank you, Mary Pat, and the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for hosting this event with me. This museum has already provided me with one of my most cherished memories as mayor. Back in 2019, which, to be honest with you, feels like a decade ago now, I had the honor and privilege of awarding a key to the city of Dallas to survivors of the Holocaust. The occasion was, for me, a solemn reminder of how hate can fester and what people are capable of doing to one another. But it was also a triumphant reminder of the strength of the human spirit and of our ability to overcome adversity. With all of that in mind tonight, I'm looking forward to this discussion. We were able to pull together an incredibly dynamic panel, and I'm so grateful to have all of them here, representing different voices and perspectives from our community. I expect a robust conversation and even possibly strong disagreements this evening. I didn't invite these panelists to join us because they all agree with one another. They have strong opinions and they know how to discuss these issues in the right way, in a respectful way, and in a way that is constructive. That's especially important to me as we honor the life and the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're living in a turbulent world. This is easily the most tumultuous time in our country since Dr. King was leading the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I know that we're hurting right now, and we all want to return to a sense of normalcy. But as someone who loves history, I also know that our world has always been full of turmoil. Peace, true peace, is actually the exception. because it is incredibly difficult to achieve. Peace requires us to think beyond ourselves and our needs and wants. It requires empathy and selflessness and understanding. It asks us to put ourselves on the line and to give more than we receive. That can seem even more challenging in a world where misinformation and lies and conspiracy theories often spread faster than the truth. A world in which people can isolate themselves and listen only to views that exploit and reinforce their existing prejudices. A world where people would rather be outraged by others than focus on how to improve themselves. Too often, increasingly complex and diverse sets of issues are boiled down to simple and dogmatic talking points. We submit to our reflexes when our world would be better served by our reflection. I know that there is a real desire for unity in this city. I believe as strongly in achieving this unity as I did the day I announced my run for mayor. But therein lies an important distinction. I don't aspire to an artificial unity characterized by platitudes and acquiescence and cheap slogans. I've heard the term "one Dallas" a lot in the past year. And let me tell you, we don't get to be one Dallas just by saying so. One Dallas should be a lofty goal that we set for ourselves, one that we must strive toward relentlessly. That will require a lot of hard work. But that is the kind of unity that I want for this city. One that is born out of a genuine understanding and respect for one another. We should embrace respectful and honest disagreement because we shouldn't want to live in an echo chamber. We need a unity that is shaped by a continuing dialogue and hard conversations, such as the one we'll have here tonight. We have to give people a place to feel safe to speak their truth, to share their experiences, and to listen to those of others. Without that, we won't have unity, at least not meaningful unity. As I mentioned, we're hosting this panel in honor of MLK Day. And something that I find remarkable as I reflect on this day is how in death, Dr. King has become a unifying figure. In fact, in this era of partisan rancor, you'll hear his speeches and writings quoted by both Democrats and Republicans. Dr. King's message of peace and understanding have universal appeal among people who can't seem to agree on much of anything these days. But in life, Dr. King was a divisive figure. He was harassed and beaten by the police. He was threatened physically. And he was surveilled by the FBI because he was viewed as a threat to this country's stability. He was maligned for taking to the streets, even in his nonviolent way. Yet, he managed over time to forge a consensus because in word and in deed, he persuaded people that the way things had always been done was inhumane and unjust and wrong. We're living through a new civil rights era today. The protests over the death of George Floyd, the hardships caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the rise of some groups dedicated to white supremacy have exposed long-standing inequities. we are talking again about what it means to be a minority in this country and what we need to do to ensure equity and equality under the law. And we are seeing similar resistance and backlash to what we saw all those decades ago. We all can do better. We have wonderful people across this great city, but we all have some existing prejudices. That's what it means to be human. There are no saints among us, but we are capable of listening to our better angels. We can grow and change our minds about each other. We need to be willing to admit our faults and our blind spots. And it's never too late to start seeing the value in each other's perspectives. My own perspective was shaped by growing up in underserved communities right here in Dallas, south of Interstate 30. And after I got a Boys and Girls Club scholarship, I spent my school days with a lot of wealthy white kids who grew up in North Dallas. The fact is, I truly believe that most of us, regardless of our skin color or any other artificial difference, all want the same things. We want to be treated with respect. We want safety for ourselves and for our families. We want to earn an honest living. And we want to be helpful and useful to other people, even if we don't always know how. I know that we can learn plenty from each other without diminishing one another. We should listen to what the victims of police brutality have to say. We should also listen to what police officers have to say. We have to be able to agree on shared goals, one of which is the need to keep our neighborhoods safe from people who mean to do us harm. That's especially important to me after we just had our most violent year in decades, one in which 141 African Americans were murdered in our city. We all need to be safe in order to thrive. We have to acknowledge our country's history of slavery and racism and police misconduct and how that has shaped our society. And we should stop belittling people who don't agree with us. That's the only way we're going to move past the violence, past the anti-Semitism, past the hatred, and past the name calling and the conspiracy peddling. I believe we can. But all of us will need to work together to get there. We need our faith leaders to use the same skills that they use every day to counsel couples and families who are struggling with grief, to help our country and help our city. We need our police officers, who often have to see the darkest side of humanity, to work with us and to hold themselves and each other accountable. We need our institutions to emphasize inclusion and encourage diversity in all of its forms. And we need individuals to find ways to serve each other as we all pursue safety, prosperity, and most of all, love. We can and we shall overcome. Thank you, and let's have a great night and a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Mayor Johnson. What a powerful message. We are very grateful for your inspirational leadership. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for tonight. When the mayor's office calls and asks people to be a panelist, we get some pretty awesome people on the panel. First, Jesuorobo Enobakhare is the chair of the Dallas Community Police Oversight Board and the founder of Jesuorobo's Thoughts, a blog that covers an array of topics, including social injustices and political and current events. He's a passionate community leader and activist. During the day, Jesuorobo is a credit bureau reporting analyst with GM Financial. Next, Eddie Garcia is the incoming police chief for the Dallas Police Department, making him the first Latino to preside over the 9th largest police department in the country. He began his career with the San Jose Police Department and has served as its chief since 2016. During his tenure in San Jose, he led initiatives to help build community trust, increase transparency, and embrace fair, impartial, constitutional policy in policing. You may have read in the Dallas Morning News today that Chief Garcia is busy studying for the Texas Commission of Law Enforcement exams. So we are especially appreciative of him making time to be with us tonight. Reverend Dr. Maria Dixon Hall is the Chief Diversity Officer and a professor at Southern Methodist University and an ordained clergy member. She has been recognized throughout her SMU career by peers and students alike for her passion for teaching and research. She developed SMU's Cultural Intelligence Initiative, now called CIQ at SMU, as a practical, effective alternative to traditional diversity training. It is now the primary training for faculty, students, and staff. In addition, she provides organizational consulting services and innovative solutions to external clients through her company, MDH and Associates. Bishop T.D. Jakes is the senior pastor of the Potter's House, Dallas, one of America's largest churches with over 30,000 members. He is also the CEO of TDJ Enterprises, a master communicator, best-selling author, filmmaker, social entrepreneur, and business leader. A true humanitarian, he has ongoing initiatives in the areas of education, healthcare, criminal justice, economic preparedness, and disaster recovery. And last but not least, Rabbi Andrew Paley is the senior rabbi at Temple Shalom and the chair of Faith Forward Dallas, a multi-faith clergy association. He is committed to the Jewish community in Dallas as well as the broader community, serving on the Dallas Morning News Faith Advisory Committee and as a Dallas police chaplain. And he has recently been a member of the Mayor's Task Force on Poverty. Rabbi Paley and Temple Shalom congregation have been great partners with the museum on multiple events, so it's great to see you tonight, Rabbi. Thank you all so much for being here tonight and for being a part of this important conversation. So now I'd love to ask you to turn on your video so our audience can see your smiling faces. And unmute yourself so we can hear your incredible words. So for our first question tonight, I'll go ahead and start asking the question while you all unmute yourselves and start sharing your video. Let's start our conversation with something that's probably top of mind for a lot of people. 2 weeks ago, the nation watched as a mob of rioters stormed the Capitol in Washington. Since then, there has been discussion about how law enforcement responded to this group compared to how they responded to Black Lives Matter protests over the summer. How would you compare the two responses based on what we currently know, and what can we learn from both? Who would like to start the conversation tonight?
Well, I think I'll jump in.
Thank you, sir.
I don't think that they are even comparable, the responses between Black Lives Matter And what we saw play out in Washington this past Wednesday, the response is not even comparable. The reasons for the incompatibility between those two responses are probably extremely complicated. I don't think that it is just totally about race, but race is certainly a strong factor that plays in to the perception, the preparedness, the response, and the reaction of those in charge of the security around Washington and around the White House. So I'm deeply concerned by that. I'm deeply concerned by the convergence of extreme groups with conservatism. And the fact that you have the same people who are smashing the heads of police officers having prayer in the chamber sends a strange signal, a signal that has been a problem all the way down to the roots of our country about how we deal with race and religion, and how religion has often camouflaged the inconsistencies in how we treated people and thereby gave people permission to feel licensed by God to do some of the most atrocious things. And that is not new to what just happened in Washington. That is all the way back to the slavery boats in 1600. And so we are in a dilemma right now because the more we blur the lines between right and wrong, the more we have the convergence between conservatism and extremism, the less we are able to distinguish, and the silence of those people, good people, is deafening when it comes to responding to the fact, and it was deafening before when Black Lives Mattered. Yes, it got covered by the press. Yes, there was a lot of talk about it on networks, but the silence was deafening from the outcry from mainstream America, people with power and influence who could really shape the narrative. It was deafening when the president said there were good people on both sides. I don't think that, yes, there were people who spoke out, but I'm talking about the supporters need to speak out and challenge. All of us need to challenge our leaders when they go left. And I think that we are seeing drudge to the surface the very brine and grit and gut of what has always existed in America. But what is deadly about it right now is that it seems to have permission to parade itself in a way that is causing people to become emboldened, people to become destructive. And might I add, I think that the fact that we don't have adequate laws about domestic terrorism indicates the fact that we don't police ourselves, we don't suspect ourselves. And had that been a group of Blacks down before they ever even got to the Capitol, there would have been a perception of danger. The fact that there was not a deep perception of danger, the fact that some of the police officers were taking selfies with the insurrectionists. They saw them as friends and allies and comrades in a way that that is something that Black people do not enjoy, that assumption of innocence. And I think all of that speaks to what the Black community has been speaking about for years and years and years. If that plays out in the nation's capital, that could play out in the bank when we go for a loan, that can play out when we dial 911, that can play out in a lot of different scenarios that don't have the benefit of as many cameras as what we saw a week ago.
Sure. Bishop Jakes, I have had a few people say to me that they compare the violence of some of the protests this summer, burning a police station, for example, or looting stores, to the violence at the Capitol. What would you say to that response?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that all violence is wrong. All violence, I don't think that we have to express ourselves by destroying anybody's property. But I don't think that there's an adequate comparison between the two extremes. First of all, this is the nation's capital, our most hallowed and most sacred ground. And to come into that area in the name of patriotism and destroy the very thing that you're supposedly representing is reprehensible. There's one thing for people to riot, which is wrong, and to indiscriminately attack property, but to come in as an American citizen and attack the American Capitol with crosses, with swastikas, with Confederate flags, the convergence of all of these different ideas, and then say, I am a patriot and I am a person of faith, and then not have people of faith not rise up and say, oh no, this does not reflect what faith ought to be, because we're concerned about being politically correct when we ought to be concerned about being politically right.
Dr. Dixon
Mary,
Hall, I see you trying to jump in. Go.
Well, I think Bishop Jakes is exactly right. But in that moment where false patriotism was being exhibited, we had wonderful opportunities to see real patriotism. We saw something that has happened throughout the history of this country, in which it came down to an African-American man deceiving the rioters and moving them away from a chamber. Again, we see this kind of patriotism from a group of people who have not always been considered or never will be considered citizens. And that perhaps is the bittersweet story of what it means to be Black in America right now. To still believe in the words, to still believe in the institutions, to know how flawed they are, but yet when it came right down to it, to stand up to defend it. That's what's amazing to me. But the second thing that I think is also problematic is that we're missing the word of power. So many of, I hate to say it, my clergy brothers and sisters made a mint out of fomenting hate. They got book deals, they got exposure on television, they got to go to the White House, and yet on the 6th of January, they were nowhere to be found. They helped to birth this riot, yet when it was time to own it, they didn't want to accept their role in it. And I think that's the thing that will come back and haunt, particularly the American church, as it haunted the German church, that it sat there silent when its symbols were being misappropriated.
Excellent point.
I can just add, I agree with everything that's been mentioned. One thing I say is that as the chairman of the Community Police Oversight Board, I'm well aware of the fact that law enforcement agencies rely on intelligence in order to be prepared for any type of domestic disturbance. Based on intelligence that was received, the outgoing Capitol Police Chief pleaded for the Pentagon to provide National Guard assistance for the January 6th First Amendment activities at the Capitol. It is reported that the director of the Army staff declined the request because he did not like the optics. He did not like the visual of the National Guard standing in line for the Capitol in the background. The Pentagon, Senate Sergeant at Arms, and House Sergeant at Arms all denied requests for additional resources to protect the Capitol. Now imagine that you have both houses of the Congress in session with the Vice President and the Vice President-elect. And they felt that there was no need for additional protection, even though intelligence told them otherwise. Right. I want to say that no one cared about the optics of overwhelming police force in the face of Black Lives Matter protesters. Or maybe they did care about the optics and they wanted Black Lives Matter protesters to feel intimidated. Just look at the incident on the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge. In Washington, D.C., hundreds stormed the Capitol, where, as I stated before, both houses of Congress were in a joint session. Right. And I need to repeat again, this joint session included both the Vice President and the Vice President-elect. And they entered the House with little resistance, whereas Black Lives Matter protesters were headed towards a closed shopping center and were met with an excessive amount of force. This unequal response is the reality that Black people live in.
Chief Garcia, and do you have anything to add? I wonder how it feels to see, people in who have sworn an oath to protect the Constitution, police officers from across the country taking part in this riot.
Yeah, well, it's, obviously I appreciate being here and I appreciate everyone's comments and what the mayor said to start this off. The difficult conversations are absolutely necessary. What I will say, and people said it very eloquently, what occurred was a travesty. There's no question about it. I will say this. I think I need to I would just say that I would be myself to be able to paint every major police department in this country with a broad brush, that each one would have responded in the same fashion as happened at the Capitol, I think can be a little unfair. Well, not a little unfair. I think it could be unfair to the men and women that have sacrificed so much to keep their communities safe. Obviously, mistakes were made. There's no question about it. Mistakes were made. The fact that the intelligence that we had wasn't acted upon, quite frankly, me and I know my other colleagues in the Major City Chiefs Association really truly have to question that. With everything that has occurred with regards to protests and riots and things of that nature, one of the arguments that's come on as well, and one of the things as police chiefs we're going to need to balance, is the fact that there's also been conversations that the mere fact, and this occurred after the summer's protests, that the mere fact of police presence could have caused and incited something that didn't necessarily need to be there. And so as chiefs, we're going to need to balance, because those conversations happen. And so we're going to need to balance the fact and look at what occurred at our nation's capital. We'll look what's occurred and then start saying to ourselves, if we need to avoid that, our goals need to remain the same, meaning we need to keep life and property safe. We need to ensure that men and women that protect us are kept safe. We need to ensure that our protesters that are practicing their rights are kept safe. And we need to have those as goals. Our tactics need to tweak and change, but the goals should always stay the same. And so regardless what the optics look like, we have to keep the goals the same. The tactics might have to change.
Excellent point. When we looked at the mob attacking the Capitol, there were horrifying images of white supremacists. And what was particularly painful to our survivors were, T-shirts that said 6M is not enough, 6 million was not enough, or the gates of Auschwitz, work will make you free. It's apparent, that there has been an unfortunate increase in the number of anti-Semitic symbols at these rallies, starting back at the Charlottesville rally. It's perhaps the most famous example of neo-Nazi demonstrations, but we see them throughout the country and all the time. And just in October, we saw horrific anti-Semitic statements and symbols painted all over the old Reunion Tower garage here in downtown Dallas. What do you think, to what do you attribute the rise of anti-Semitism? And what can be done to stop it?
I'll jump in. First of all, thank you, Mary Pat, for being our moderator today. And thank you, Mr. Mayor, for bringing us all together for this important conversation. And to my colleagues, I'm humbled to share our screens together in this way. Mary Pat, you're right. Everyone should know that recently the Anti-Defamation League noted that there were over 2,100 incidents of anti-Semitism in their most recent accounting, which represented a 12% increase from the previous year and the highest number of recorded incidents since they started keeping track of incidents back in 1979.
Right.
Look, in as much as there's a lot to discover and unpack about the anti-Jewish, anti-Israel ecosystem, I think we can't really fully understand this rise without understanding the origins of the rise of white supremacy and its ideology, driving terrible, awful acts over the past number of years. The neo-Nazis, as you mentioned, marching at night by torchlight through Charlottesville, chanting "Jews will not replace us," is just a grotesque and shocking example. Seeing the recent insurrection at the Capitol and wearing those T-shirts, 6 million weren't enough, Camp Auschwitz, just absolutely abhorrent. And the truth of the matter is, we know that these events didn't just happen by accident, overnight, but rather were encouraged by both dangerous rhetoric by local and national leaders, encouraging the worst in human behavior, and by ordinary people being actively indifferent, right?
Yeah.
Trying hard not to be involved, not to do exactly what you, Mary Pat, are leading us to try to stand against. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and the like all share a core center of baseless hatred and calculated opportunism.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is, there'll always be a segment of society that will hate, that wants to do that. What we can do, however, is to partner together, especially with organizations like yours, the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, which continue to educate and condemn hate groups and hate speech, and provide important optics and forums of our community, especially its leaders, the elected leaders, the business leaders, the law enforcement, and the clergy coming together in support and collaboration with each other. That, I think, will go a long way.
Rabbi, there was another study last year, I'm sure you know of, but that the Claims Conference created to find out knowledge of millennials and Gen Zers about the history of the Holocaust. And, among other things, it showed that there is a very a dearth of knowledge. As the event is further in the past, people are less likely to know about it. But also, 50% of those polled said that they had seen Holocaust denial or distortion in social media in the last year. I wonder what role social media is playing in fomenting this hatred, and the connection between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism.
Look, in a forum where everything is equal, where every comment carries the same weight as every other comment, it becomes increasingly more complicated to filter out that which, frankly, is not true, our lies and distortions from information that really needs to be disseminated to prevent all of these things. When I was a kid, we only had three TV stations, four, kind of, sort of, and now there are literally hundreds of opportunities to engage with news that is out there. The fact that these that certain organizations have been called into question, the veracity of their claims and their integrity about what they're reporting is just astounding. I've never seen anything quite like it. And then you have a forum, an online forum, where people can say whatever they want and whatever they want that looks real, that might sort of be connected even tangentially with the truth. There is a lot that has to be addressed in terms of the amount of this information that has to be placed in its proper context. I think we're missing that context. And when we miss opportunities to say, wait a second, that isn't accurate, and here's the information that supports the truth, as it were, it's a much more daunting task than it's ever been, but it has to be done. And like I said, there'll always be that segment that wants to do it, that tries to do it. But we as leaders in our own right have an additional calling to sort of to say that thing that's being promoted, that just isn't right. And collaborating with colleagues and organizations to call out those inaccuracies and that misinformation is now more important than ever.
Well, that's kind of difficult, Rabbi, in today's college classrooms. It is a daunting task when, you know, even as a professor, you are having to justify your education, you're having to justify your scholarship, and more importantly, we are underestimating the generational divide. This is not just young white Gen Zers who may not have an understanding of the Holocaust. I actually had an African American student tell me, "Why do you keep bringing up Dr. King?" What, you know? So okay, so who is this C.T. Vivian? Who, you know? And so
Wow.
individuals that were grounded into who I am and what I understood as my heritage in this country, the further we get away from it, it feels as far away as, you know, the landing of settlers into Plymouth Bay. And for them, if it hasn't happened in the last 10 years, then it really didn't happen. This is also a generation that has no appreciation. And when I say appreciation, I don't mean it pejoratively. They did not witness the falling of the towers. So that is ancient history to them.
It's a challenge.
So we have to remember that we're all, we believe in what is recent is most important. So that's why history is such a difficult thing for us, is because there is nothing new under the sun. And so that's why it's always amazing to me that we act surprised that things happen. And so with a lot of today's students, when, you know, we're having to compete with Google, as my children remind me, well, Mom, we'll just Google it. And Google said, that's the difficulty, is that these things have no foundation in their present lives. So they've not seen that. This is about as close as they've come, but they've been a generation who's lived in chaos so long that they're numb to it.
I want to interject something here.
Yes,
I always get a little pensive at these conversations because I really have to bridle my tongue for fear that I will go off the rail. But I think it's important to understand that I think it goes deeper. You know, it's wonderful to have the museum. It's wonderful to have MLK Day. It's wonderful to have Black History Month. But we have failed our children academically. The portrayal that we have in this country in our education systems, the way we gloss over our history, the way that we tell the story in a way where we always win, and we were always right, and we were always positive, creates a myth of exceptionalism where we are not quite as exceptional as we would like to think that we were. And I think it goes all the way. You learn your values at home, and that needs to happen in the way we parent. And I think that parents have been derelict of their responsibility and simply teaching the value of human life, the respect for an individual, the way you respond to a person, to speak to people, to greet people, just basic, simple things. And then to go to a school that glosses over the history of this country, the Native Americans, the way this country came into being, the slavery, the whole issue of slavery, and how the story is told. And then when you get into the Holocaust, no wonder there's an indifference, because right now it's not just that we're competing with social media and all types of information out there. We should not have to go to Google to educate our children when we send them to school with taxpayer dollars. And those taxpayer dollars are not just white dollars. They're all color dollars. And it's very, very important that we start at the earliest of ages, arming people with the kinds of information that they need, and make sure that we are telling the whole story and the full story and the complete reality of what happened. Other than, I think that we have become so concerned about protecting our image that I think some of our academic books were written by PR people. We need to go back a minute, and because you can't heal where you don't have truth. So what people are saying today that passes for healing is just compliance. Just be quiet. Don't bring up anything that makes me uncomfortable, and that way we'll have peace. And that's like a bad marriage where nobody's talking, and as long as we're not having an argument, it means we're getting along. That's not true at all. In reality, you can't have justice, you can't have righteousness, you can't have integrity until you have truth. And we have to back all the way back up. We have never told the story the way it ought to be told. And when I came up, the story started in my house, not in the schools. The story started with my grandparents. Today, we have young parents, busy parents. They don't instill those kinds of values, and we find ourselves in a critical situation. We should not have to get in the car and drive downtown to find out what the Holocaust means. We might want to explore it in a deeper way by going there, but our first encounters with that, and it's not just white people, Black people, as my friend just said, often don't know their own history, their own background. Anytime you can rise to the level of the highest level of leadership in this country and not know that Frederick Douglass is dead, and not know what Juneteenth is, and not have any clue. We live in a country where I can't get a GED without understanding white America, and you can get a PhD and not understand me. So we really need to dig deeper into how we educate people, because what we are dealing with is rampant ignorance. And the only way to defeat ignorance is with education and truth. And I'm not even talking about upper levels of education. I'm talking about in the very early stages where some things are self-evident. Self-evident.
Well, and we could talk for days about the education system and issues there, and how textbooks are chosen, and really all of the demands that are placed on teachers that make it impossible for them to teach some of the content the students really need. But I think education is the key, Bishop Jakes. I agree with you, and I hope that we can all focus on how we can support our teachers, and that boy, they're doing God's work, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Chief Garcia, do I see you?
I unmuted real quick.
Jump
Just,
in.
something that resonated at the pastor said. I think all of us as leaders there, or in our community, in thinking about how we really look at ourselves as cogs in the wheel and what we can do in our sphere of influence. One thing from a law enforcement perspective, as the pastor says, that we gloss over the negative parts of history so oftentimes. And I'd be honest with you, and I'll say this as police chief, and say that never is that more true than in American law enforcement, where we need to educate our officers and our individuals in our academies that learning Texas law is just as important as learning about the atrocities that American law enforcement has done onto our communities, particularly our communities of color, and to have an understanding of that. I'll tell you, it's a shame that, I watched the movie The 13th about 5 years ago and was shocked actually to find out some of the things, having been a police officer for nearly 25 years. There's movie LA 92 is another great documentary on Netflix, that us as officers need to understand in law enforcement that the badge that we wear, that we're so proud to wear today, didn't always shine so brightly. That we've had difficult conversations. We teamed up in my old department with our local university, and we teach our academy recruits now the negative history of American law enforcement. That's not to say that we're not supportive of the men and women as they go out to keep our community safe, to take the criminal element off the street, but to have an understanding why just simply wearing a uniform doesn't gain you respect immediately comes because of some deep-rooted atrocities that have occurred. And so I couldn't agree more with the pastor with regards to we've glossed over too much, and we need to have that realization.
Jesuorobo, I see you raising your hand. Please jump in.
Okay. In my opinion, the era of Donald Trump normalized behavior that had been trapped in the outer fringes of society for many years. The reality is that decades ago, many exchanged hoods for business suits and placed the neo-Nazi paraphernalia in their closets and basements. Those who never made the change were exiled. Not to make this a partisan discussion, but Trump made a home for them in the Republican Party. And instead of our Republican elected officials standing up for their proposed values, they instead quietly welcomed them in and allowed them to become a desperately sought voting demographic. Now, this is more than just about a political party. This goes much deeper. We are not a divided nation as some may think. We are a nation that is in a battle against the bastions of white supremacy. If we look at immigration, healthcare, economics, education, civil rights, criminal justice, it's all one battle. A battle where you see an extremely diverse group of Americans of all races, gender, creeds, religion, etc., fighting for equality and equity versus those fighting to not only maintain a status of institutional and structural racism, but to create a new status quo that champions it. You saw that with the attempted overthrow of the US government the exact day after an African-American pastor of the same church previously pastored by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. won a seat in the state of Georgia, a Senate seat in the state of Georgia, a state that had never had a Black person as a senator, and a Jewish American who was announced winner just hours before the attack. And these same Republicans had the audacity to quote Dr. King on MLK Day as if no one was watching. As President-elect Biden has mentioned, this is a battle for the very heart and soul of our nation. Do we truly become the beacon on the hill, or are we just imposters?
Wow, powerful words. Thank you. We'll come back to that, but I want to pivot just quickly to talk about, we were talking about equity and the systemic issues, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the lack of equity in policing. As we all know, in recent years, the U.S. has seen cases of highly questionable and criminal deadly use of force by police officers on people of color. And the list of names is lengthy, including Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Eric Garner, and we could go on and on. And in Dallas alone, multiple police officers have been convicted in cases, including 2 on murder charges. But George Floyd's case in particular galvanized people in a new way. What was it about the case that made it such a tipping point for people's understanding of the issue? And I think we can all agree it wasn't a tipping point for everyone. In some ways it makes us feel more divided, but I do think that people who had not thought about this issue before suddenly became aware. My son would say woke, and were really attuned to this issue. And how do we, so how do you account for that, and how do we translate that awareness into a call to action for policy change?
Well, Mary Pat, I think one of the things that we need to take into consideration is the fact that people saw the inhumanity.
Right.
They saw someone with their knee on someone's neck with their hands in their pocket, where everyone saw the image simultaneously. I am old enough, I hate to say, to remember when we all saw Rodney King.
Sure.
But the thing that I would say is that's what galvanized everybody. Everybody was outraged. My thing is, we're always outraged until the next outrage. We're always upset until the next name. And there are some people who've made this a tragedy sport, meaning I'm just going to go with the next cause and not wanting to do the hard systemic work that each of these cases require of us. These are systems that have to be torn down. And as someone who had a number of my white colleagues reach out and say, just to put it in terms of being a theologian, what must I do to be saved? To me is be woke more than just right now. Be woke to all of the other issues we just finished talking about, of education, of healthcare. George Floyd was already had somebody's knee on his neck. You
Right.
just didn't see it.
Mm.
You just didn't see it. The system in and of itself had a knee on his neck. And so we were motivated because the horror made us move. But it moved us to the streets. It may have moved some of us to the ballot box, but the hard work of staying in it day in and day out, I'm afraid, I wonder, I fear whether or not we have the stomach to go behind and get into the dirty parts of the work we need to do.
Well, as it relates to police violence and inequity towards people of color, where do you believe Dallas stands in terms of the progress that we've made of officer accountability, and what more can be done to really make positive changes here in Dallas?
So I'll take that one. I believe we've made great strides in officer accountability with the creation of community panels that work with Chief Hall in addressing policing concerns and the creation of the Community Police Oversight Board and the Office of Community Police Oversight. But when you have an Amber Geiger case where an officer walks into someone's residence, that about them, John, shoots and kills them, and then the president of the police association turns the cameras off in the squad car to talk to the killer, that action in itself takes the wind out of the sails of any accomplishments that may have been made and makes everyone feel as though any progress is just superficial. The fragile trust that was so hard to establish can be and was taken away in an instant.
So, but so what can we do, Mr. Enobakhare, to bring about change, to demand change? Tell us about the oversight board that you're responsible for and how citizens can take part in that effort.
Okay, one of the things, and before I bring up the oversight board, we have to remember that our police officers are held to the standard of enforcing the law on the books. They shouldn't choose which laws they want to enforce and which ones they don't. And so when we're looking at these laws that are unjust, that are unreasonable, we need to reach out to our elected officials and have those laws changed so that our police officers are not forced to enforce laws that we feel are not just. Now, in regards to the oversight board and the Office of Community Police Oversight, one of the things that civilians in the city of Dallas did not truly have was a way to bring feedback or complaints against police officers to the police department. Prior to Chief Hall becoming the police chief, there wasn't even an official way to file a complaint against a police officer. And if you had one and you went to a police department to try to file it, sometimes you would get intimidated into not filing that complaint. So then now we can talk for days about the history of oversight. This is not the first time that oversight was created in the city of Dallas, but when it was initially created, police associations felt that it was too powerful, and they were able to get the city council to take all of the power away. And so some of the same individuals that created the first oversight board were very integral in creating the second. And so what we've designed is not just a board for people to bring complaints forward, which is very important. If someone feels as though they were mistreated by the police, they should be able to have a vehicle for them to provide that feedback and for it to be reviewed and for them to feel as though the outcome is a reasonable outcome. That's what our board is designed to do. Now, another thing that the board is able to do with the creation of the Office of Community Police Oversight is also, one, bring recommendations of improvements in police policy. We can draft those, we can bring those to either the city council, the city manager, or the police chief, whichever we feel we need to send it to. Also, we can work within the community and provide avenues for civilians to learn more about policing. We can also be the bridge to build a stronger relationship between the community and the police department. Because one of the things that the community wants, they don't want to feel as though they're living in a police state. They want to feel as though they're living in an environment where they are controlling how they are being policed. And that's what Oversight does. In my opinion, Oversight is the window of accountability to the police department.
So the challenge in the mayor's remarks, he commented on the number of homicides that we had in 2020. We had more murders last year than any year since 1998, 252 victims, of which 141 were Black and 77 were Hispanic, so very disproportionately represented. How can the Dallas Police Department balance the need to protect those communities, but also address police reform and make sure that we are meeting the needs of our community? Chief Garcia, I know you're not officially on the job yet, so I don't want to put you, it's almost unfair to ask you these questions, but.
May I jump in and just say something for a moment? I think what's unfair is that we leave all of the problems at the doorstep of the police.
Yes, sir.
I think it is an oversimplification to think that more policing will lower the murder rate in our city. Yes, 2020, our numbers were exponentially high, but 2020 is also a year that we spent quarantined, full of COVID, dealing with all kinds of issues, dealing with the lack of jobs, lack of opportunities, depression, suicide rates were up, domestic violence was up. People can't cope. I often say I have never seen anybody mug somebody at 2 o'clock in the morning who had to go to work in the morning. Where there are no jobs, where there is no hope, where there is no opportunity, where you can see no advancement, all of that plays into the scenario. And to leave all of it at the doorstep of the police, I think is a misappropriation of responsibility and not realistic. To someone whose only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
So Bishop Jakes, are you having any conversations in your congregation about, I think defunding the police is a misnomer. It makes, people feel like the people that are in favor of that want to eliminate the police. But I think, the movement is looking at potentially moving some funds to social services or to address some of those root causes that you have just brought up. Where do you think Dallas stands on that issue? Do you hear a movement of people wanting to have serious discussion about defunding the police?
I am encouraged. No, I'm not hearing so many people talking about defunding the police, and it may be that I'm in a vacuum. And I can speak for myself. I definitely want, when I dial 911, I want somebody to answer and come quickly.
Me too.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I am not on that page at all. However, I don't think the police are the enemy, are always the enemy in a sociological construct that does not lend itself to hope and opportunity. And I think it's an oversimplification to reduce it to just that. Now, where we get the money from, whether we take it from this department or that department, I'll leave that to greater minds than my own. But I do know at the end of the day, this anger and hostility, incidentally, as much coming from the Black community as it is from the extremists that we see in Washington, they're on totally different sides, but they're angry about the same thing. Lack of jobs, lack of opportunities, lack of advancement. We have to solve these problems. The good news is I do see in Dallas amongst the CEOs and the corporate leaders of this city an earnest interest in making this a priority and creating better job opportunities. I do think that there is an awakening, albeit late, where more people in power are starting to understand you cannot live in a society where you have and the other people have not, and expect it to be a safe place to live.
Right.
No matter the color of the skin. It's
Yeah.
unfortunate that we have to talk about this in color, because what this past Wednesday proved is that behavior has nothing to do with skin tone. So I think when we take it out of the box of race and talk about conditions and circumstances, when people are oppressed, they attack. And when people don't have room and they're sheltered in a place where you've got 5 kids living in a 2-bedroom apartment over top of a 2-bedroom apartment that's got 5 kids downstairs, and somebody's got COVID, and you tell them to shelter in place, that is not realistic. When you've got these types of situations, no jobs, and those who had jobs have now lost their jobs, when you recognize that the equity gap between white America in the US average home is $171,000, as opposed to the income amongst African Americans being extremely lower, almost $40,000 a year lower. And it's hard for you to make it. It's impossible for us to make it. When you have a Congress that spends months and months and months negotiating, and then finally sends you $600 after you've been unemployed for 3 months, $600 won't pay a month's rent in Dallas.
That's right.
So these people who would never live with $600 hand us $600 and go home and sleep good at night and brag about how they're helping the people. We have to get real. People can't live off of that kind of money.
And I do think, as you said, there are some very encouraging signs that corporate leaders and city leaders are really focused on the root causes, efforts to end child poverty in Dallas. And Rabbi, I know that you were, part of the mayor's council on trying to eradicate poverty. I want to come back to that issue, but I see Chief Garcia has raised his hand, and we've been talking about his work and not including him in the conversation. So Chief, take a turn.
No, that's okay. I've enjoyed listening to the points of view. I'll say this when it comes to the points that have been made with regards to the policing. We talk about the high number of homicides in the city of Dallas this year, but I'll tell you this, but you also talked about the disparity of the victims. If we had 100 less homicides in the city of Dallas, some may think that's success. However, if that disparity was still the same, with the majority of those victims being black or brown, our black or brown communities, is that really success? Because I would venture a guess that it's not. We can say from the macro level and say, hey, we reduced homicide by 100, great. But if I came back here and told you next year that 85 to 90% of all of our victims were black and brown, we still should be as frustrated, and we still should be as angry as we are today, because that's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear homicides go down by 100 and we still have disparity of 85 to 90% being communities of color, and then we're excited about that. That's not factual. That shouldn't be the case. We need to be data driven.
Okay.
We need to be data driven. We know that the roots of violent crime stem from socioeconomics, mental health, drug dependency, education, poverty, and things of that nature. We are not going to arrest our way out of the problem, but there are data-driven approaches that we can do as a police department to help reduce violent crime, and we'll do that. Long-term, we need to give people hope. We need to give people resources. We need to ensure that there's another pathway, that we're, on one hand, we're not going to sit here and accept the violence that's occurring. On the other hand, we need to show people that there's a right way to do it with jobs and other things. And so I just will say that we need to continue to, we're going to stymie this. But what I will say is, lower numbers, if we're talking about the holistic approach to our city and true equity, then we need to look at the disparity, regardless where the numbers are of homicides in this city, to see where we need that help.
That's right. That's right. Mr. Enobakhare, I see your hand up. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to just chime in. I agree with everything that everyone has said, especially Chief Garcia, in that even if we do reduce the homicide tremendously, but you don't change the disparity, you still have a problem. It may seem as though the city is great for tourism. You may be able to advertise it to get, some other companies to come here, but you still have that disparity that if another crisis happens, you see the crime rate explode again. So the only way that you're really going to be able to fight that type of crime is you have to be proactive, meaning that, as the chief said, as Bishop said, you have to bring hope. You have to bring opportunity. If you don't have hope and opportunity, and all you're focusing on is reducing crime, it's always going to be a moving target.
So what can the 500 plus people that are watching, and listening along with us tonight, what can they do to make the city safer and more equitable and more understanding? What can we inspire our friends and neighbors who aren't watching tonight to do, where we can start to have a real movement in the city?
Well, look, I think there's, first of all, I think everyone needs to know that that we're not powerless here, that we don't have to wait for anyone else to do something in our city. Some of us understand our call to action precisely because our religious tradition tells us not to stand idle while our neighbor bleeds. And that means all of our neighbors, not just the ones who may live next door to us, but all of those who live in the community of our great city. And so, so part of it means actually leaving our homes. And I know that's difficult in this environment. I'm sort of looking to the future a little bit here, but leaving our homes and being present where the conversations and collaborations can take place. My teachers like to remind us, and I've said this a lot, I teach this a lot, that you can pretend to care, right? You can say the words and you can maybe write a letter or something like that, but you cannot pretend to show up. And when you show up as a result of your convictions that this is not right, what we're seeing, this is not the hatred and the vitriol is not right, then just being there with others who shoulder to shoulder, when God willing that could happen, really, really matters. The optics of that are really powerful. And that's just an easy step. Being involved and willing to have a conversation like the one we're having here matters as well. And I think this has sort of demonstrated that there is clear commonality in our frustration to see a better, safer, more congenial city. But there's a lot of work to be done. When I show up to rallies and to places and pray with my feet, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to describe, that I'm there, and then am attacked, right, because of my religious views or my position regarding X, Y, and Z. It just exacerbates the problem that there is more conversation that needs to be had. My tradition tells me that when two people are sitting together, really trying to figure this out, both sides, the teaching goes, these and these are the words of the living God, that my way doesn't have to negate your way and vice versa. And if we're willing to try, and organizations like mine, and I know others on the panel who are willing to bring people together to try to have these conversations, that really matters.
But one of the things I would say, Rabbi, I think that is a fantastic idea, and it certainly resonates with my own tradition. But I would say this: you cannot do that in a city that is so segregated that you have people who live on one section of town who never interact with a whole other part of town.
Right.
And one of the things that totally amazed me when I moved to Dallas was how segregated it was. I couldn't believe it. I mean, moving from Atlanta to Dallas was a culture shock for me. Because I actually kept looking around, looking for people who looked like me, who lived near the university that I work in. And I realized that there's not that many people who did. So much so, I had a police officer who stopped me and asked me what I was doing in the Park Cities.
Wow.
So the reality is that it's not just going to be enough for us to want to go and visit. Too much of what I've seen in Dallas is what I call mission-based guilt. People want to treat other people like a mission rather than a relationship.
Huh.
I will go down and I will feed you. I will come over and take a photo op with you. But heaven forbid I have to sit in the classroom with you, or I have to actually dissect things with you. I don't want to do that. In order for us to truly move forward, we have to recognize, number one, we may not like each other, and that's okay. But the second thing is we do have to learn how to work and live together. And I think that's what the mayor was calling us to do. So we put away some of the platitudes that we've had forever, particularly around my field of diversity training. Of if I just tell you what not to do, you'll be a better person.
Right.
No, people are not
Check.
going to be better people. That, and I like to say some of this is a conversion thing that has to happen for some people. They will have to work out with their God some of their behavior. But when we work together, when we play together, when we go to school together and we live next to each other, then we realize that we do have to work together. We have had diversity programs since the 1970s. If it just took a diversity program, we'd be done and I'd be out of a job. But the reality is we have diversity, but we don't know how to talk to each other.
Right.
We don't know how to talk to each other because we don't ask questions of one another. And when we do ask questions, then we want to get mad because you asked me the question. That's not real communication. Communication happens when we have shared meaning. When my meaning and your meaning overlap, that's communication, not talking at each other. So I'm kind of proud of some of the things that my good colleague Richie Butler is doing with Project Unity. And together we dine. And Richie's been able to leverage that in so many different ways. Together we test.
Right.
In which churches that never would have thought about having a COVID testing site north of I-30 now are having it and inviting neighbors. And I think that's where we will have to transcend, is get out of the platitudes, get out of the I want a kumbaya moment, and recognize that we need just the same amount of time we used to take to get to know another culture when we used to be able to go abroad. We need to be taking that same energy and getting to know the people who live in our own cities. If I need to take a Babel class to learn French, then I should take a Babel class to understand somebody in West Texas, which as a Southerner, that still worries me. I don't know how to do it yet, but I'm working on it.
That's a tall order. So I wonder, as
of passion we do about getting to know folks across the water, we're not going to be okay here.
Right.
Because even though we speak English, we don't speak with the same heart, we don't speak with the same mind, and we don't speak with the same experiences.
So we are, we're coming close to the end of our time. We could clearly continue talking about this for hours and learning from each other. But I'd love, at the risk of ending, with platitudes. I don't want platitudes, but I would love for each of you to share with our listeners something that makes you hopeful. We've had such a hard year. It's been hard years, but we went through so much last year, and I think we all need to have a little hope to kind of rekindle our desire to be part of this process. What makes you hopeful, Bishop Jakes?
A lot of things make me hopeful. This conversation makes me hopeful. I wish, to your point about what can the listeners do, they can do this. you can go outside of your bubble
Mhm.
and make friends with people legitimately, go the extra mile and invite people to dinner once we get past this pandemic and sit and talk and learn. I am hopeful by the fact that we are learning that we need each other. The pandemic is teaching us that no one is exempt from the attack, and so no one can be exempt from concern.
Right.
I think we're being forced into situations where we have to interact with people that we didn't normally have to interact with. And I want to say this one thing. When you go outside of your orbit, don't come as a teacher. Come as a student. Come to learn. Come to observe. And we tell people we need to talk. I stopped saying that. We don't need to talk. We need to listen.
Mm.
That makes me hopeful.
Dr. Dixon Home, how about you?
You know, call me naive, but my students make me hopeful. My students really do. I think I've lost you a little bit here. My students make me hopeful.
Yeah. Good.
My students make me hopeful. Every year, every semester, I see how they grow. I see how they change. And it may not be all of them, but I will tell you, I've watched some wonderful world changers graduate from this university.
Mm-hmm.
Young women and young men of all walks of life, all colors, Greek and non-Greek, who have given their lives in service, even if, regardless of what their field is. And so I have hope. We start a new semester in just a week, and I've gotten to already see some students, and I hear the excitement. I hear the willingness to get back at it. I hear a willingness to believe. And I think that's something that youth does give us. It reminds us that it's okay to believe again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Chief Garcia, you're next on my screen. What makes you don't get out of answering this question?
No, I'm actually glad you gave me an opportunity to answer the question, but I'll tell you what I am most hopeful for. This has been a tough year for law enforcement.
Sure.
You know, it's the vast majority of the men and women that wear uniforms all around this country sacrifice their lives for their communities. They sacrifice their lives for their neighborhoods that are impacted by violence. You know, just here in California, I'm moving out to Texas here next week, and just here in California, just a little north of me, a Sacramento County Sheriff deputy last night was shot and killed in a car stop with a parolee. His canine was shot and killed. The deputy was shot and killed.
I'm so
And
sorry.
it harkened on me that department today will have men and women that will go out into their communities, do a righteous job, and do what they can to keep those communities safe. And I have no doubt that the men and women of the Dallas Police Department are going out today like they did after their tragedy and are going to do the same. So in light of everything that law enforcement has been through this year, we will get better, but the heart and soul of the men and women that defend and protect their communities in this country are going to get up, come to work, and continue to do that. And that makes me extremely hopeful.
Me too. Absolutely. Mr. Enobakhare, what makes you hopeful?
Well, first, I just want to, Mary, I want to thank you and Mayor Johnson and the Dallas Holocaust Museum for hosting this important discussion. I think it was very needed, and I've learned a lot sitting here with this esteemed panel. What makes me hopeful? 2020 has been a horrible year.
Right.
As some would say, you know, 2020 made a lot of people realize the earth is ghetto. But I'm going to say this. What brings me joy is the fact that we do have the next generation of leaders that are developing. We saw them leading protests. We saw them leading demonstrations. And they had the courage to go out in the streets, even though we were in the midst of a pandemic, because they felt that injustice and fighting injustice was more important than cowering to a pandemic. And so when you have leaders that show that level of courage, you know that our future is safe.
That's right. Amen. Rabbi, how about you?
So I think for me, there are three things that that give me hope. I've been thinking about these for a while. As I mentioned before, what gives me hope is that humanity is not powerless. You know, in my tradition, when we light a candle to start a holiday or a holy moment, that is a metaphor and a statement that the darkness that we see around us does not have to be the permanent feature that we experience, that we can do something as simple as lighting a candle to say that we will not tolerate the darkness. So first, I know that we are imbued with the possibility and the potential to do incredible things, bringing light and hope and possibility. And even through this pandemic, we have seen individuals care for family and community in ways that are just outstanding and just unbelievable. It's so creative. Whether they're drive-by, letting people know that they're thought of who can't get out of their house, whether they are providing meals or doing, people are doing that, and those stories are just incredibly encouraging. The second thing is that I know that there are colleagues all around our city, certainly the ones who are here and all across in every direction, who really do care about making our city better, safer, kinder, and filled with blessing and hope and possibility to work towards solving some of those systemic problems that we know need addressing. And I remember on July 6th, a number of years ago, when Chief Brown said to the people of our city, "We need help. We need you." And that was the day after that I decided to become a police chaplain, who can see that these people, these dedicated servants who are there to care for us, who are put in incredibly complicated situations, are trying to actually do the right thing in the right way, knowing that, as the chief said, they're getting up and doing that in spite of everything else that's going on around them and in their own lives as well, is just an incredibly powerful image. So there's lots to be hopeful for. And I'm actually even more hopeful after this conversation than I was before, knowing that there are even more people who share this idea and this hope.
Well, each of you have given me a tremendous amount of hope. I mean, we are blessed to have some incredible leaders in our community, and I look forward. I'd love to go to dinner with each of you and get to know you, and I promise to listen and not teach. I know we could continue this conversation for hours, but our time is up. But I want to again extend my thanks to Mayor Johnson and his team for inviting us to partner with him tonight, and to each of you for sharing your passion and your honesty and your wisdom with us. I hope that tonight's conversation is just the beginning, and that we will continue to share our thoughts and ideas openly and honestly with each other to create real change. And I see Mayor Johnson back on the call. Would you like to say something in closing, Mayor?
My kids are here listening, and so I just want to say thank you so much.
Your kids give us hope.
We all learned from the conversation tonight, and I just want to say to all the panelists, thank you so much for your participation. And Mary Pat, thank you so much for doing a great job moderating.
Thank you. I hope that each of you watching tonight, if you haven't been to the museum, that you'll come visit. If you do, budget your time and make sure that you have enough time to go through the final wing of the permanent exhibition. It's called Pivot to America. And in that wing, we celebrate upstanders who have worked and are continuing to work throughout our democratic process to ensure that our ideals apply to all citizens. So every visitor who comes to our museum will see their family's history reflected in some way. So please come visit. Let us know how we can be a part of the solution. Keep doing your work, and everyone have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.